Next up is David Giffels. David is the author of The Hard Way on Purpose, Essays and Dispatches from the Rust Belt, which was nominated for the Penn Diamonstein Spielvogel Award for the art of the essay. You guys, you have no idea how hard I practiced that. Thank you, thank you. He is also the author of the memoir All the Way Home, winner of the Ohio Book Award. His writing has appeared in the New York Times Magazine, TheAtlantic.com, Parade, The Wall Street Journal, Esquire.com, Grantland.com, Redbook, and many other publications. Fun fact, he was also a writer for the MTV series Beavis and Butthead. Yeah. David is an associate professor of English at the University of Akron, where he teaches creative nonfiction to the very lucky students in the Northeast Ohio Master of Fine Arts program. David Giffels.
I really want to do a Ramones style 1, 2, 3, 4 to start this, but I know I'd probably count wrong, so I'm just gonna nod to an all. All through my childhood, I was fascinated by my father's workshop. It was in the basement of the old house I grew up in. This was a space he had claimed for himself, a dusty, tool-strewn haven off in the corner where he built and designed things, fixed problems, and probably thought about big life stuff. It's possible my fascination began with the poster of Cheryl Ladd that hung on the workshop door featuring about 9 miles of cleavage. But it was more about all the Midwestern exotica inside, strange hammers, a crosscut saw, an anvil. Who owns an anvil? Wile E. Coyote, the village blacksmith, and my dad. But it was more the proximity to my father that drew me, the way that I could work with him, watch him, learn lessons by way of his table saw and a drill press. Soon enough, I grew up into something like a man and bought a house of my own. Not coincidentally, that was a falling down wreck and required not only the tricks and skills I'd learned from my father, but also his frequent help. He walked in the first time, looked around, and said, "There's nothing but memory holding this place up." And then he said, "Let's fix it." To my great fortune, this house came equipped with a pretty Italian Catholic girl, who taught me even more than my father. We made our family there, we grew up together. Gina was the youngest of 7 children, and has always been kind of ahead of me on life experience. She had 5 older sisters who taught her all about life and relationships and the politics of dancing way before I understood any of those things. Meanwhile, as young men will do, I started to wonder about the big questions, the meaning of life, the meaning of death. When you're young, these questions are compelling because they're hypothetical. As you get older, they're compelling because they're not. They become real. And so it happened that my father-in-law died. While we were at the funeral home making the arrangements, I noticed far off in the corner a cardboard coffin. I called Gina over and said, "That's what I want to be buried in." She said, "You are not going to be buried in a cardboard box." With that, I became convinced that all I wanted was to be buried in a cardboard box. Not long afterward, the family was gathered to celebrate my father's 80th birthday. Over a few beers, I told him about this cardboard casket, and he immediately became interested. Gina renewed her objection, and I looked at him and said, "You and I could build a casket." He thought that was a brilliant idea. As it turns out, there are very few regulations on caskets. Not only that, but there's a thriving industry selling these things. You can buy all kinds of novelty caskets, such as this coffin made of bacon. It comes complete with a bacon air freshener, quote, "for when you get that buried underground, not so fresh feeling." So we got started. My dad's a retired civil engineer, and he loves designing things. We drew up a set of plans, bought a stack of lumber at Home Depot, and started in on this unusual seat-of-the-pants father and son project. I began making regular trips out to his workshop, and it took on a life of its own. As a writer, I began to see this pursuit as an undeniable metaphor, a tangible way to try to get my head around the big questions of life and death. My dad was in his 80s, and I wondered how long I'd still have him around for these kinds of pursuits. I was nearing 50 and thinking about age. The coffin seemed a way to explore all this and write about it. And then, right in the middle of this, my mother died, unexpectedly. As happens when we lose a parent, the notion of mortality changed immediately and dramatically. The person who had brought me into the world was no longer in the world. The old cliche that life is short changes when you have real evidence. And then, a year later, my best friend since high school, John Puya, also died. Other than Gina, this was the person I had most closely shared my growing up with. We were constant companions and experienced all of our coming of age moments together. We shared our kids' lives and music and mischief. A long time ago, as a writer, I came to understand an important truth. You don't get ideas. Ideas get you. Anytime I've tried to control a subject, it has proven to have a life of its own. In this case, the writing gods seemed to be taunting me. Fine, you want to write about mortality? We'll give you something to think about. I've never really believed in the idea of writing therapy. Writing is work, it's my job. But the experience of writing my way through the big, difficult questions as I was experiencing them showed me the value of these stories. Losing the physical presence of the people we love doesn't mean we've lost them. So we continued building this thing, and it became pretty evident that the real reason for this pursuit was to spend time with my dad. Before John died, his life and my life had gotten so busy that we scheduled a standing monthly breakfast date, which we agreed was both an artificial and genuine way to keep our friendship alive. This project felt the same. Meanwhile, he was hard to pin down in the workshop, constantly busy, going to basketball games with my brothers, working on his own projects. At one point, he took off to Germany. Here he is in front of a castle in the mountains, looking like he's on top of the world. So it ended up taking a couple of years, but we finally did finish the casket. Now, as you might imagine, storing a casket for what I hope will be many, many years presents its own challenges. I decided to fit it with shelves and use it as a bookcase. But this is what happens when you get it up on end and you leave the room for a tape measure. The writing part of this, meanwhile, has turned into a book titled Furnishing Eternity, which will be released next January. I think the best thing that happened in that part of the process was the note my editor sent when he first saw the manuscript. He said, "David, this isn't really a book about a coffin." And I agreed with him completely. So the box is done, but my dad and I continue to find new ways to spend time together. As an engineer, he has always been fascinated with bridges. So this spring, we took a trip to New York City and walked together across the Brooklyn Bridge. When we got to the other side, we sat down and had a beer and talked for a long time. Thank you.